Yes.
Yesterday, we began the introduction, and I just want to conclude with a few last thoughts, and then we will begin the actual Talmudic study of Tractate Brachos. So we reached the era of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, which is the redactor of the Mishnah. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, he has a few names. He's also called Rebbe. And he lived in the 2nd century, and he passed away around the year 200. And he gathered together all the Mishnayos, and according to most opinions, he was the one who put them into writing. Other opinions say maybe rabbis after him actually wrote them down. But ultimately, the Mishnayos were all set up in his time. And after he passed away, he lived in Israel. After he passed away, so there were 3 major rabbis that led the Jewish people. They were all his students: Rav, Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan stayed in Israel. He opened up a yeshiva in Tiberia, and he continued teaching, Talmudic studies, or I should say he started teaching Talmudic studies because the Mishnah was completely canonized, and they were able to expound on the Mishnah. Rav and Shmuel traveled from Israel to Babylonia, and which is basically different cities in Iraq. They opened up yeshivas. Rav initially came to Neherda, and then he ended up moving to Sura and opening up a yeshiva there. And Shmuel was in Neherda. When Rav left, Shmuel opened up the yeshiva in Neherda after Rav left. And then after that, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Yechezkel opened up a big yeshiva in Pumbedisa. This is years later. And the Neherda yeshiva ended when Rav passed away, Shmuel passed away, and ultimately the yeshiva Neherda closed, and Reb Nachman opened up a yeshiva in Mechuzah. So this is basically the history of the origin of the Talmud, because these are the rabbis that opened up their yeshivas. And in these yeshivas, what they did was they expounded on the Mishnahs. So the Mishnah was now complete. They now had what to expound upon. They had the ability to discuss and debate. And that's really what the Talmud is, a bunch of debates trying to understand the Mishnah. So what we see here is that there was a group in Israel, and that was under the scholarship, under the leadership of Rabbi Yochanan, who was all 3 of these rabbis, Rav, Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan, were all students of Rebbe, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, his 3 titles. They were all his students, and they opened up yeshivas. The Talmud Yerushalmi I started talking about yesterday, that was Rabbi Yochanan's accomplishment. Rabbi Yochanan was in Israel, so we call it the Talmud Yerushalmi, even though it wasn't really Yerushalayim. I'll have to look up why it's called Yerushalmi, even though it wasn't really Yerushalayim, it was Tiberia really. But for whatever reason, it's called the Talmud Yerushalmi, and that was Rabbi Yochanan put that together. Now, I should say that persecution, there was a lot of persecution against the Jewish people, especially in Israel. And because of that, Rabbi Yochanan had to finalize the Jerusalem Talmud earlier than the rabbis in Iraq, Babylonia, before they concluded their Talmud, because Rabbi Yochanan saw that things were, things were getting very dangerous. Cities were being destroyed, and Rabbi Yochanan ultimately concluded the Talmud Yerushalmi in the fourth. Well, he concluded it, and obviously was printed afterwards. There are some proofs that it was still being developed a little later. There were some additions, I should say, that were added by his students and so on. But ultimately, it was printed. It was concluded in the 4th century, and the Talmud Bavli wasn't concluded until the 6th century. So, and we mentioned yesterday that the halacha, we follow the Talmud Bavli over the Yerushalmi, the Babylonian Talmud, which we've mentioned is based on the yeshivas that were in Babylonia, and which is Iraq, and a number of different yeshivas were there. Sura, Neherda, Pumbedisa, Mechuzah. These yeshivas were basically the Talmud, the source of the Talmud Bavli. Now, the halacha, I said, follows the Bavli. Why is that? So the first reason is that when you have rabbis that are aware of all the halachic writings that were in the past, and yet they conclude that the halacha should be differently, meaning they've read through all of the teachings of the past, we follow their opinion because it's called halacha kibasra. The halacha follows the later rabbi. Why does it follow the later rabbi? Because he's aware of all the previous writings, and he's aware of the later writings. And so he has it all in front of him. He's able to make the decision of which one, he has what to compare it against and choose which one is more logical to be the intent of the Torah. And so the Torah was given to humans to understand. We are meant to study it to the best of our knowledge. And therefore, the halacha follows the later. So therefore, the Bavli, the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud is the Talmud that we would use as the halachic final law. Now, the another point is that, and I touched upon this yesterday, but I didn't fully develop this thought, and that is that the Yerushalayim Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi, is a little, it's much more brief and much less debates. It's not as colorful maybe as the Talmud Bavli. And because of that, the Talmud Bavli is much more alive with fighting, debating, arguing. And because there is more debates, the truth is accomplished through debates. And therefore, this would give a reason why we should follow the Bavli, because the debates bring out the essence of the matter, which allows you to conclude a halachic rendition based on the refinement of the logic behind the laws. You're able to render halachic renditions. So that would be another reason why we should follow the Bavli. It's interesting, there's a verse that they use to describe the Talmud Bavli. The verse goes like this: B'machshakim heshivani. In the darkness, God has brought me back. And that is that sometimes you can conclude a explanation based on darkness, that, well, it can't be this explanation because that doesn't fit. And it can't be, it's process of elimination. And by going through the darkness, you're able to come out with the actual correct version, the correct light. And that would be the Talmud Bavli. That verse is used to explain the Talmud Bavli. According to Hasidic teachings, the Talmud Bavli would fit with the way that God wanted that we should work harder and refine. We have to do more refinement to the physical world, and which includes even our thought process. So in a certain sense, the Talmud Bavli does more by the debating and by the dealing with the darkness and refining the darkness. We're able to elevate all those thoughts and all that, all those ideas are able to be refined and elevated for holiness. So in a certain sense, the Talmud Bavli affects the world more than the Talmud Yerushalmi. Talmud Yerushalmi is more like a revelation, and the Talmud Bavli is more like physical labor refining our mind and doing this physical labor. So in a certain sense, it accomplishes more to refine the world and make the world a holier place. It's interesting to note, I was once listening to a lecture from a professor that was talking about the Talmud, and he mentioned that we know the Talmud has to be from the 6th century and not later. We know it must have been organized and finalized somewhere around there, because he says the simple reason is that historical events, relative chronology, of course, makes sense that it fits within that time. But he also said we don't find any references to Islam in the Talmud. We do find references to Yashka in the Talmud. So he said this is a good proof that that the Talmud wasn't later than that, because otherwise there would definitely have been some type of references somewhere in the Talmud to these other historical events in the world. Of course, in Maimonides, you do find some hints to Islam and other writings, even Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer, you find other hints to Islam and references to Islam and so on. And so he said that is a proof that the Talmud was finalized, the Babylonian Talmud was finalized, not later than the 6th century. I mentioned yesterday that the Talmud is like a repository of the rabbinic culture, like a Farbrengen. Everyone, adds their 2 cents when they try to discuss one of the Mishnahs. They all share their opinions. But what's interesting, and this is really what is important to mention in connection with this idea, that all the statements that the rabbis make are all related to each other. They're connected to the previous statement. So it's not like just everyone's just throwing thoughts out, but it actually flows. And the trick in studying the Talmud is to try to figure out the connection sometimes between a previous statement and the statement said afterwards. And that's one of the things that the commentaries work on. It's trying to figure out connections between previous statements and statements that are said later. Now, the commentaries on the Talmud are numerous. There's a huge amount of commentaries on the Talmud. And then there are super commentaries, which means commentaries that explain the commentaries on the Talmud. We generally divide the 2 types of commentaries by the era that they lived. The first commentaries, or the commentaries on the Talmud, we call the Rishonim, the earlier ones. And the later commentaries, which is like after, from the 16th century and later, we call the Achronim. So these are common words you'll hear among rabbis, that they'll call a commentary Rishonim. Who are the Rishonim, the earlier commentaries on the Talmud? Rashi, Tosfos, the Rambam, the Rif, the Ramban, the Ritva, the Rajba, the Ran. These are all famous commentaries on the Talmud. They're called the Rishonim, and they were from the end of the Talmud until the 16th century. They're called the Rishonim. Then you have commentaries that not only are explaining the Talmud, but they're explaining the views of the earlier commentaries of the Talmud. And these commentaries, we call them the Achronim, the later ones. So they're from the 16th century and on. I did skip out that there is an era right after the Talmud was completed for great Talmudic scholars that were living at the time when the Talmud ended, and they're called the Rabbanan Savaroi and the Goinim. So there was an era where we had a Goinim, a small era, period of time that we had rabbis. We called them the Goinim, Rav Shrira Goin, and a few other Rav Hai Goin. And these Goinim, we actually get a lot of information from them of how the Talmud was studied, much earlier on in the earlier centuries. But right after that period was the Rishonim's time, and we consider all the great rabbis of the Rishonim to be to an extent that we won't argue with them, meaning their opinion. The later ones can't really argue on the earlier commentaries of the Talmud. So the first commentary, the commentaries that, it's like saying you can't really argue on Rashi. Rashi gives his explanation on the Talmud, and you have another explanation you want to give. You can say, well, I have a insight, but you can't argue on Rashi. Rashi's pshat is the correct pshat. You might have a deeper, a nice insight, something, like a drush, it would be called, like a drasha, like a midrashic. You want to add some insight, something cute onto, is acceptable, but you can't argue on Rashi. You can't argue on Tosfos. You can't argue on the Ritva. Their pshat, their opinion is valid. We try to figure out what they meant if we have any questions, but their opinion is is something you can't argue on. Now, the Rashi is the most simple commentary on the Talmud. Tosfos is really there to answer contradictions. So on the right side of the on the middle section of the Talmud is commentary written along the sides of the Talmud. So the middle section is always Rashi. The outer section, the column that's always near the end of the page, the outer end of the page, is the Tosfos. And Tosfos is answering contradictions between this Talmud says here, the Talmud says this, a different place it says that. How does this? How do you reconcile the contradictions? There is a source that says that Tosfos had 60 members, and they gave all of the members of Tosfos a tractate to study inside out. So each of the members knew one tractate extremely, extremely well. And when they would come and discuss their different tractates, whenever a point was brought up from a certain tractate, they would say, "Oh, you're the one who knows that tractate. Tell us about that point that's being brought up here. Tell us tell us about it, because it's from your tractate." And this way, they were really able to, develop a very precise explanation, understanding of each of the tractates. Now, what's interesting about the Talmud is that we don't have so many conclusions. There's a lot of debates, a lot of discussions, but the conclusions are missing very often. So, you study a Talmud and and someone comes and asks you, what is the law in this case? And you think, well, I just studied that. Wow, I should really know that. And the answer is no, you haven't the slightest idea what the law is. And the reason you haven't the slightest idea is because the Talmud gave you too much information, maybe, and it didn't conclude. It didn't tell you what the final law is, and that's where the halachic books come in. And there is a reason why the Talmud doesn't conclude. The Talmud is not meant for you to just open it up and decide what the law is. It's excuse me, it's meant for discussions. That's really what it's meant for. It's meant to be a book of discussions that you can study the godly wisdom that the rabbis were trying to decipher what the best explanation is, and you are able to touch upon that and connect with it, study it. You can have your you can offer your thoughts on the matter. Of course, you can't argue with the Talmud, but you can add insight. And so the Talmud was not meant to be a book of the final law. It was meant for us to be able to see what the discussions were. And of course, the rabbis of the generation, they can write down or they can give you the final answer based on the way they study, based on their study of the Talmud. What's interesting about the Talmud is that, or at least the Mishnah is definitely this way, the tense that's used is the current, is the present tense. It's not the past tense. So you don't read a Mishnah, Rabbi Meir said, this is the law, and Rabbi Judah said, that is the law. No. It's Rabbi Meir says, Rabbi Yehuda says. It's almost like it's alive. Their views are alive, and they're right in front of us. And of course, this fits well with this Talmudic statement that says that whenever you repeat something from someone that passed away, his teachings, when you repeat the teachings of someone that passed away, it says his lips are moving in the grave, which means that they're still alive in a certain sense, and their teachings are still alive. You know, and so this is maybe why the Talmud uses the present tense instead of the past tense. Now, one of the questions that is asked when you study Talmud is the Talmud a means to come to explain the Mishnah, or I'm sorry, let me start again. Is the Talmud a means to explain the commandments, or is the Talmud an end in and of itself? Of course, the Talmud is there to explain the Mishnah, which is discussing all the commandments. We know there are 613 commandments, and each of the Mishnahs are really explaining many of the laws, either the commandments of the Torah or the rabbinic commandments, and the Talmud is explaining the Mishnah. So it's definitely explaining the laws, and it gives details about the laws. But on the other hand, there's numerous places where it leaves you up in the air. It doesn't answer the question. It leaves the question unanswered. There is so much extra information of the Talmud that's not applicable to the laws, and so we have this question: is the Talmud really meant for explaining the laws, or does it have a different, is there something, is there a different purpose of the Talmud? Is the study of Talmud a purpose in and of itself? And the answer really is that it's both. Of course, we need the Talmud to understand the laws, but it really is an end in and of itself. It's a purpose to study the Talmud, even not for the purpose of knowing the laws. The actual study of the Talmud is a great mitzvah. One of the prayers we say every day is the Talmud Torah keneged kulam, that Torah equals all of the mitzvahs. So it's not like the Torah is there to, just for the purpose of fulfilling the mitzvahs. The Torah is a entity in and of itself. And there is a statement that says, "V'chol chafetzecha lo yishvu ba." None of your desires can be compared to the Torah. And then it says, even the desires of heaven, meaning even commandments, even mitzvahs, cannot be compared to the Torah. So there's an element in the Torah, in the study of Torah, or especially the Talmud, that is there simply for the purpose of studying. And there's a statement that we say also at the end of davening, Yagdil Torah v'yadir. Beautify the Torah, make the Torah greater and more beautiful. And that also emphasizes this idea that the Torah in and of itself is a great mitzvah, even not for the purpose of having a conclusive answer for our law, for laws, or even if it's not explaining a law, it itself is a mitzvah. And it's interesting that the Talmud attaches equal weight to the practical laws and to the theoretical teachings, to the binding laws and to the non-binding statements of the Talmud. The Talmud is godly wisdom. It allows us to connect to Hashem through studying his wisdom. And what's really important when you study the Talmud is to realize that you're connecting to Hashem, because it's very easy to study the Talmud, and the Talmud gets so sidetracked in its practical legal matters and deciding things that you almost forget. You think you're in a class of science or monetary laws, legal matters, and you almost forget that that this is godly wisdom. So it's very important to always remember this is Hashem's wisdom, and we are connecting to Hashem in the greatest way possible is through the Torah. And what's really nice is when there's a Hasidic teaching that gives a different insight into the practical law that you're learning, and you can see how this teaches you something about serving Hashem. So you see the deeper meaning of the law and how it connects you to Hashem, how it really gives you an insight in serving Hashem. Another important point is that similar to what I mentioned earlier, that the Rishonim are the commentaries on the Talmud. The later commentaries cannot argue on the earlier commentaries. The Achronim don't argue on the early. That applied also earlier on. The authors of the Mishnah were considered on a higher pedestal, and the Talmud cannot argue on the Tanoim. The Amoraim, the rabbis of the Talmud are called the Amoraim. They cannot argue on the Tanoim, the authors of the Mishnah and the Brises. They cannot argue on them. Also, lessons from the Mishnah are drawn not only from what's said in the Mishnah, but the order of the statements in the Mishnah are important. There's lessons that are drawn from them, and the choice of words that are the words that were chosen to be used, that also is a very important point, used in the Talmud as a proof to certain matters because they chose these words and not other words. And every argument, this is something that's really interesting. The Talmud tries to get to the basis of every argument. And what happens is when you get to the basis of every argument, you actually realize that the rabbis agree on almost every part except this small little fine detail. This is what they argue on. And because of that little detail, that's why their argument ends up being a difference in law in a certain case, in a certain scenario. So the Talmud often tries to get to the bottom of it, the fine detail in what the rabbis are arguing about. And what you see really is that they really agree on almost everything. They only argue on a very subtle point. And so in a certain sense, it shows the unity of and how minimal their argument really is. It's generally on a very subtle point. And the final thing that to conclude this introduction is that Rav Ashi is the one who gathered all the Talmudic literature Ravina and Ravashi, and finally, he lived in the end of the 4th century, but it was ultimately gathered together and then, finally put into writing, and with obviously many statements added and so on by the 6th century, and that's what we have today, and that's called the Talmud. So now we're going to open up the Talmud, which is we now have 15 minutes left to actually start the Talmud. So we're going to open up. If you have your if you have the Talmud, great. We're going to start from page Beis. Every Talmudic tractate starts with page Beis. It starts with page 2. And one of the reasons for that, I was taught, is that page 1 of the Talmud is Reishis Chochma Yiras Hashem. Before you study, you always have to have fear of God. So fear of God is number 1. And page 2 is how the Talmud always starts on a page 2, because before that, you always have to think of Hashem and have fear of Hashem. In Derech Eretz Kadma LaTorah, we have respect, in Derech Eretz, honor for Hashem, and only afterwards can we actually study Torah. Derech Eretz also means respect for other individuals and being a mensch and so on. These all come first. So page Aleph is the Menschlichkeit, and it's fear of Hashem and so on. And then we can actually start the Talmud. So please open up your Gemara Brachos, page Beis. And now if you look at the page of the Talmud, you see that there's a column in the middle. That is the Mishnah and the Talmud. So let's take a look. The Mishnah begins with the word in the big box called Me'emasai. If you're looking at the Hebrew, there's a big box and it says one word, and that's how the Talmud begins, Me'emasai. And Me'emasai is the first word, and then it continues with the word Koirin on the second line. And again, we're looking at the middle column. If you go down about 15 lines, you'll see in the middle of the line, there's a large print, in a bold print, Gimel Mem. That means Gemara. And what that means is that the Talmud begins, of course, every tractate is like this. Every Talmud begins with a Mishnah. So it brings from the Mishnah. And then we have the rabbis of the Talmud are going to debate what the meaning is. And that's where the Gemara, Gimel Mem stands for Gemara, and that's where that begins. And if you take your, you turn some pages, and you will find that the commentaries, not the commentaries, the comments of the rabbis of the Talmud continue for a number of pages until we have the next Mishnah, and then they will be discussing the next Mishnah, and that is going to be a number of pages later, and it is, to be exact, on page Tes Amud Beis, on page 18. If you look at the numbers on the top, some of you have page numbers on the top. It would be page 18, and the common way that pages of the Talmud are counted are one page per 2 sides. So this page is the number Beis 2, and the next page is Gimel. Even though we have 2 sides, the way it's termed is Beis Amud Aleph. This is page 2, side 1. This is page 2, side 2. And here you have page 3, side 1, page 3, side 2. So every page has a side to it. So this is page Beis, is how the Talmud starts. And then, as I mentioned, the next Mishnah will be on page Tes, which is page 9, side 2. And so our Mishnah starts with Me'emasai, from when? From when do we read Shema? Me'emasai kirines Shema ba'arvin. From when do we read Shema in the evening? And that is the question of the Mishnah. From when do we read it in the evening? And the Mishnah answers this question. Misha'a shehakoyanim nichnasim, from the time that the kohanim enter, le'achoil bitru masan, to eat in their truma. So the question was, when is the earliest time? From when do we read Shema in the evening? And the answer is from the time that the kohanim enter to eat their truma. So, number one, we see here that nothing is going to be given to you on a silver platter. It would have been nice if it just had a time, like 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, but it doesn't work that way. The Talmud gives you an answer, the Mishnah gives you an answer. No, it's when the kohanim, now you got to figure out when do the kohanim enter to eat their truma. But before we discuss that, we have to first understand what does this mean? The kohanim enter to eat their truma. So what this means is that nowadays you don't find this. So we have to change the way we think and think of how it was in the time of the temple. In temple times, the kohanim often would be given gifts of food called truma. And that's what the kohanim lived on. They relied on these donations. But the donations were not just donations, there were strings attached, not from the giver, but from Hashem. The strings attached were that the kohen was allowed to eat truma. It's holy, it's something very holy, but he had to make sure to eat it with holiness. What happens if the kohen went and was on the street and he became impure? Someone impure touched him. What happens then if the kohen became tameh? So what happens is, depending on the type of tuma, impurity, if it's not the severe impurity of tameh mace, of touching a dead body, but it's less, then the kohen goes to the mikvah. Yes, a mikvah in those days was an obligation for men. Nowadays, men go to the mikvah. It's more of an extra element of holiness and purity. We go to the mikvah before Shabbos, before Yontiv. Some people go every day. It's definitely a tremendous thing. But in the days of the temple, the men would go to mikvah very often if they were impure. Even non-kohanim, if they wanted to go to the temple for the holidays, they would have to become pure. And if they wanted to hang out with kohens, or if they wanted to separate the truma of their among their produce, they wanted to separate the tithings, so they would need to be pure. So men would go to mikvah. Of course, women also had to go to mikvah for the same reasons. If they touched something that they could have ended up ruining the truma. So the kohanim were not allowed to eat truma if they were impure, and so they would go to the mikvah, and during the day, and when the sun set or when the stars came out, the permit, the ability to eat truma would take place. So in other words, once the day ended, they went to mikvah and the day ended, now they're allowed to eat truma. They're not allowed to eat kodshim, holy things, but they're allowed to eat truma. Kodshim are sacrifices. The sacrifices that were brought on the altar had more of a serious laws, and they would have to, the kohen would first need to bring the carbon in the morning, the next morning after went to the mikvah, the sun set, the next morning, bring the sacrifices, then he would be allowed to eat kudshim, holy things. But before that, the Kohen would be allowed to eat truma at the night after he goes to the mikvah. So going to the mikvah doesn't finalize it. It still needs to become night. So what our Mishnah just concluded saying was, when do you say the Shema? When the Kohen is able to eat truma. So what this means is that the real time of night for the Kohen is the same time of night for saying Shema. Whatever that time is, it's going to be the same. If the Kohen is allowed to eat the truma, even though he was impure, but he went to mikvah and the sun set and the stars came out, depending on whatever this means, that is when a person can say Shema. So that's the first statement of the Mishnah. And then the Mishnah continues and it says, ad, until. So you say Shema from when the Kohen enters to eat truma, until ad, soif hashmura harishona, the end of the first watching, divrei Rebbe Eliezer. These are the words of Rebbe Eliezer. So when can you say Shema until? So for example, you go to an event and you didn't say the service at night, and you get home, it's already midnight. Are you allowed to still say the Shema? It's not, the sun, it's not the time the sun set. It's not the 3 stars came out. You're ready like 4 hours later and maybe 6 hours later. And you went to a wedding, you came back real late, stayed till the end. And now you want to know if you can say the Shema. So Rabbi Eliezer says, once you've missed the boat, it's basically too late. Ad soif hashmur rishona. When is that time? The end of the first watching. Once the end of the first watching happens, you can't say Shema anymore. You missed out. You missed out on this positive mitzvah of saying the Shema. What does this mean until the first watching? So the first watching means that there are angels that do their job of praises in front of Hashem. And there are 3 groups. And the groups are divided into in the night, there are a division of 3 groups of angels. So the angels of the first group are called the first watching. The angels of the second group would be the second watching, and the angels of the third group would be the third watching. So what time would that be? When would the end of the first watching be? So it would be, if you divide the 12 hours of the night into 3, it would be 4 hours. So you've got 4 hours to say Shema, according to Rebbe Eliezer, approximately 4 hours, because the night, of course, is not always exactly 12 hours. It might start at 7 o'clock and it might end at 5 o'clock. So you would divide that period of time into 12 parts and or divide it into 3 parts. And the end of the first part would be your 4 hour limit of saying the Shema. This is Rabbi Eliezer's view. We don't, there's 2 other views in the Mishnah, but I'm not going to study them now because our time is basically up. Does anyone have any questions? You're all unmuted. So if you're on a telephone, you might have to press *6. You're welcome to ask questions. Otherwise, we're going to turn now to the Tanya session. And we have Rabbi Cohen, who has been teaching Tanya for many years. He is going to be teaching Tanya for the last 15 minutes. Okay, let me give the class over to Rabbi Cohen. Rabbi Cohen, you're on.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay. I'm going to start straight from what we call in the Tanya, we call this in Yiddish, the Shara Blat. Shar means the introduction, means the door. And Blat in Yiddish means the page. So the page of introduction. The page of introduction of Tanya is very, very important. As we're going to see, it's only a few words, but we're going to see that contains the whole Tanya. So I'm going to start from the beginning, and slowly we're going to also learn about the Alter Rebbe a little bit. So when we'll take some time to stop, we'll go slowly, as we know that the Alter Rebbe took many, many years to write the Tanya. And there was once a question for him whether to put a vav or not. A vav in Hebrew, it's a letter that we call this vav amechaber, a vav that puts together two words, the one before. And the Alter Rebbe had a question for 6 weeks whether to put a vav or not in the Tanya. So every word is very important. I'm not saying that I understand every word, but we'll try together to go through Tanya and slowly, translate the words, understand. So this is the beginning of Tanya. Sefer Likutei Amorim. So the Alter Rebbe, the name, why we call him Alter? Alter in Yiddish means old. In Hebrew would be Rabbeinu Hazoken. We know somebody else who was also Hillel Hazoken. So he looks like it's a title that was given to a few people. I've seen other rabbis that were called Hazoken. But he looks like it's a title that was given to very, very few people and very special rabbis, like Hillel Hazoken. Hillel Hazoken was one of the first Tanoim from the Gemara, from the Mishnah. There's a story that I learned not long ago about Hillel Hazoken. It says over there that he had a lot of Talmidim, a lot of students. And the 20 top students that he had were the same level as Moshe Rabbeinu. They were so high connected to Hashem that they were able to get the Shekhinah like Moshe Rabbeinu got. Those was the 21st top student that he had. And then there's also a story about the 20 middle students that he had. The top one was Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel. It says about him that when he was studying Torah and there was a bird flying on top of him, the bird would burn. He was a very, very holy rabbi. He wrote also a Targum, the Targum Yonatan ben Uziel. So he was also a Talmid of Hillel Hazoken. And since you're learning Gemara, the one that was one of the small, they call it the smallest Talmid of Hillel Hazoken, was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He wrote the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. And he was just the way we describe him, he was a very, very holy man. So those are the small students. So Hazoken, I would presume when the Jewish people accepted to call somebody a rabbi with the name Hazoken, not because he had a white beard, but there was a very, very holy title. So this is the Alter Rebbe or Rabbeinu Hazoken. So I think we're going to call him, during the Tanya, we're going to call him the Alter Rebbe. Everybody's okay with that? Okay. So he writes like this, Sefer Likutei Amorim. This is a Sefer, a book, which is Likutei Amorim. I've gathered a few parts from different places of the Torah and different rabbis. I'm going to know who are those rabbis later. And I put them together. That's what he's saying, basically. He says, I didn't write anything new. And if you go through Tanya, you're going to see that all the reference that the Alter Rebbe brings, they're all from the Torah. They're all from the Chumash, from the Gemara, from the Medrash. So he's not saying anything new. He's only bringing things that we didn't even see before. Things that we may read every day. Things that we say every day in the prayer that we don't pay attention. So he's trying to say that he's going to write this sefer, this book, to bring a bunch of things that we didn't pay attention to. But not only we didn't pay attention to, but those are the things that can change our lives. The Tanya is a life changer. Tanya is a way for a man to become the best of himself, according to himself and according to God. And slowly the Tanya will teach us that by learning the way we work, we're going to understand Hashem much more. There's a pasuk that says, from my own flesh, I will understand God. Umebsari, from my flesh, echeze, I will see Eloka, God. And the Tanya amplifies a lot to say that when you understand the way you work, the way your brains work, the way your emotion works, the way a person works inside of himself, so you're also going to understand the way Hashem works. Because we just learned in this parsha last week that when Hashem created man, what did he say? Naaseh Adam ketzalmenu kidmutenu, right? Hashem said to the Malachim, I want to make a man that will resemble us. Me, he meant me. So Hashem created any human being in a way that he reacts also like Hashem. And Tanya will teach us that in order to react like Hashem, you need to know who you are yourself. And that's the beginning of Tanya. He's going to teach us the truth about who we are. And that's why Tanya talks to each one individually. And that's why it doesn't matter what level we're learning, what level we are in life, whether we're religious, not religious, I would believe even Jewish or not Jewish. But Tanya is something that really comes to the level of every single person. You could be a child, you could be, doesn't matter who you are, man or woman, doesn't matter. Tanya talks to everybody. So that's the first things that he says, that when I'm coming to bring in this book, it's only places, take things that I've taken from different rabbis. Obviously, we see also here a lot of humility because, many people, when they write a book, they want to make sure that everyone knows it's my book, right? And here it's telling for you from the beginning that I'm not writing anything new. Humility is a very, very important thing for everybody, but most especially for people who are very holy, because it's very tricky. The more you know, the more knowledge you have, it's more difficult to be humble. Simple as that. We see with the Baal Shem Tov, we see this very, very open. When the Baal Shem Tov came to reveal himself, he wanted to make sure that Jews understand that you don't have to know a lot to be the most connected to Hashem. People at the time of the Baal Shem Tov, and even before, give me a second. People at the time of the Baal Shem Tov, there was a lot of separation between the knowledgeable people, the Chachamim, the Talmid Chachamim, and the simple Jews who were very religious, or maybe less, but they were not knowledgeable at all because they couldn't learn, they didn't have time. At the time, people, talking about most of the Jews at the time, they were working in fields. I mean, there were Jews also who were doing other things, but most people at the time in Russia, Ukraine, were working very, very hard in the field. And there was no time for them to learn. But they were very religious. I mean, they were really, they knew maybe sometime how to daven. Most time they do know how to daven. They were saying Tehillim, but they didn't understand a word what they were saying. And there was a big separation between the Talmidei Chachamim, the yeshiva boys and the yeshiva rabbis at the time, who were really putting a big separation between them and the simple Jews, what we call simple, which simple is really not a good word. In Hebrew, it's called pashut. Pashut means, in Hebrew, pashut means when you take away everything. Lifshot means to take out, to take away. So when you take away all the garbage, you have the real person. So that's what those Jews were. They were real people. And the Talmidei Chachamim, the more you know, as I'm trying to explain you, the more you know, the more difficult to be real. Because you feel like, you know something. And you actually do know something. That's the problem. But the question is, how you connecting with your knowledge. But the Baal Shem Tov wanted to understand, to make people understand, and especially those Jews, those simple Jews, that they were very, very, very holy, just the way they were. Of course, it would be better if they learned. I mean, you encourage them to study and everything, but they were working, but he was trying to explain, there's many, many stories. I encourage people to read stories about the Baal Shem Tov. There were many, many stories where the Baal Shem Tov was showing his students and many, many other people the holiness of those Jews. So humility is very, very important. We see with Moshe Rabbeinu, the only quality that the Torah gives to Moshe Rabbeinu is that he was humble. The Torah doesn't give him a quality. When we say the Torah, we mean God. God doesn't say that he was amazing with his people, a great shepherd. Of course, he was all of those things, but the quality that the Torah gives to Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe was the most humble person, and the Chassidus explains a real humility. It doesn't mean that you treat yourself like garbage. That's not humility. Humility is that you know exactly who you are. Moshe Rabbeinu knew exactly who he was. He knew that he was the one who took the Jews out of Egypt, of course, with Hashem's help. Yam Suf, the passing of the sea, etc. He knew exactly that Hashem was using him as a very, very holy man. But he thought that if anybody had the same gift that Hashem gave him or was chosen by God, he would probably do better. Which that's how we should think in general. Because we believe anybody can be better than God. And Moshe Rabbeinu believed that if Hashem had chosen anybody else from the Bnei Yisrael, maybe he would have better qualities. Moshe Rabbeinu knew that he was stuttering, right? He couldn't speak. He thought maybe someone who could speak better would have been better. I'm not saying that's what he thought, but I'm saying that's, in general, that's how he saw the thing, that if anybody would have had the same job that Hashem gave me, he would have done a better job. But that's true. It doesn't mean that he didn't know who he was. That's true humility. So when the Rebbe here, the Alter Rebbe writes, Sefer Likutei Amorim, so we see already a big, big touch of humility, because when we look at the Tanya, it's just unbelievable. We're going to learn a lot of stories, but the Tanya is very, very, very special. It's special because the Alter Rebbe straight said that with this Tanya book, we'll go with Mashiach to the Geula. This is also said by the Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berlichov. He said the same thing, that with the Sefer Tanya, we'll be walking with Mashiach. So Tanya has a tremendous impact that Pashut brings the Geula. That was said by many, many Rebbeim. And we know that it's all based on Kabbalah. Tanya has a lot of reference to the Ariya Kodesh, Arizal, Eitz Chaim. There's a lot of places. So a lot of places from Kabbalah are brought down in the Tanya and explained. And the whole concept of the Tanya is that not only you understand concepts from Kabbalah that may not make sense, but you're able to understand them in your head, in the concept of Chabad. That's what Chabad is. Before the Baal Shem Tov, there was also Chassidut, but it was more like difficult to bring it inside. And the Alter Rebbe wanted, through Chabad, what is Chabad? Chochma Bina Dat. We're going to learn about this from the beginning of Tanya. Chabad is Chochma, it's the acronym Rashi Tevot, Chochma Bina Dat. Those are the three faculties that we have in the intellect. We're going to learn about this very, very soon in the beginning of Tanya. So the Alter Rebbe wanted that through Chabad that we have inside our intellect, we are going to be able to teach the emotions how to react. Because we all trying to do good. We all trying to do our best. But we have nature from the beginning that were in us, in our genes, the way we grew up and everything. It's called midot raot. It's very simple. It's called bad emotions. Every one of us were born with bad emotions, which are natural. The Tanya is going to tell you this is called the nefesh habamis, the animal soul. The animal soul also has Chabad, as an intellect, and has the 7 emotions to react. But the Tanya would want to teach you that you are able to control your emotion with your head. With your Chabad, you are able to control yourself and to understand yourself and to do very, very good things in this world and be the best of yourself. So this is the Tanya in a little bit. And then he goes on to say, Chelek Rishon, the first part of Tanya, Anikra B'Shem Sefer Shel Beinunim. The first part of Tanya, it's called the Book of Beinunim. What is Beinuni? Beinuni in Hebrew means a middle person. So the middle person here in Tanya, and we're going to learn about this a bit more later, but a middle person in Tanya here is talking about the best of a man that you can be. This is what he calls a middle person. Why is called a middle person? Because you're not a tzaddik and you're not a rasha. A lot of people think that this guy's a tzaddik, or I am a tzaddik, or he's a tzaddik. Tzaddik, and the Tanya from the beginning is going to teach you that the real meaning of a tzaddik, not the way we use the name tzaddik, but the real name, the real meaning of a tzaddik is a person that doesn't have a Yetzer Hara anymore. Or he had it before and he killed it, like King David. King David had to fight against his Yetzer Hara very, very, very much. But he did. He fasted and he had to separate from his wife, according to some people, but he had to completely fight his Yetzer Hara very, very, very hard. And at the end, he said in Tehillim, "V'libi chalal bekirbi," that I don't have the spot of my Yetzer Hara, which is the left part of the heart. We're going to learn this in Tanya. It's gone. V'libi and my heart, where the Yetzer Hara is, chalal. Chalal means empty hole. Bekirbi, inside of me, it's empty. So that's what a tzaddik is. A tzaddik is not someone that you see that's, wow, this guy is praying, this guy is doing this guy's forget about religion. I mean, this is not what a tzaddik is. A tzaddik is a person, and people don't know who's a tzaddik really. I mean, we presume this is a tzaddik, but a tzaddik is someone that doesn't have a Yetzer Hara anymore, finished.
Rabbi Cohen, I think we need to conclude.
Oh, yeah, you could have, yeah, okay.
So thank you all for joining us. If any of you want to ask any questions, you're